Good morning, Dan and Amy. So it seems as if the potential list of candidates for Secretary of State has expanded to include Rex Tillerson, who's the CEO of ExxonMobil. Well, that would be a fascinating pick, as well as John Huntsman. And look, I'm willing to support former Utah Governor John Huntsman for Secretary of State.
Why? So if he brings his good-looking daughters with all the time?
No, well, that would help. But there's another contingency.
What?
The contingency is he has to wear that crushed velvet smoking jacket that he sported in the 2012 presidential debate as Secretary of State. And he also has to stop speaking in Mandarin when he's addressing the American people.
Former ambassador to China.
So I don't think that's a lot to ask.
No, but I think that the Huntsman is just to poke at Mitt Romney because Huntsman and Mitt Romney, they're second cousins once removed, and they're rivals. So I think that maybe this is Donald Trump's
classic
way of just...
Mormon rivalry. And then General Petraeus was on over the weekend paying penance for his sins by going on the Sunday talk shows and being interviewed by nitwits.
It was an exclusive by your guy, George Stephanopoulos.
Clinton Foundation donor zero.
Yeah, so did he vote for the man he wants him to be his boss?
Did President-elect Trump ask you if you voted for him?
I don't vote, so that's an easy answer. And I also did not support him, nor did I oppose him, nor did I support or oppose any other candidate. I've truly tried to be apolitical, non-political, George, as I think you know. And so that was a pretty easy question to answer.
It's interesting. Have a man who's like the embodiment of Switzerland as our Secretary of State. I don't know about that, but for more on that topic and many others, spin the globe with Washington Times columnist, American Spectator contributor, and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Jed Babbin. Jed, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, great to be with you guys.
So what's your disposition with respect to Secretary of State?
Well, my disposition is that I don't think that really we've seen the best of the lot, at least yet. The people who are clearly most qualified in my mind are John Bolton, who was ambassador to the UN and is used to dealing with the State Department.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, is a good, tough conservative.
Yeah.
And Rudy Giuliani. He is also someone who, contrary to what is popularly thought, he has a pretty good experience with foreign policy and made some very great points in my mind when, as a matter of fact, right after 9/11, he tossed that check from the Saudi prince back at him. After the Saudi prince had said, well, basically these attacks are your fault, he just said, well, he used much more moderate language than those of us who grew up in the Bronx would have. But that proved him to be a good, tough diplomat in my book. Rudy or John, I don't think there's anybody else qualified right now to be Secretary of State.
Even former General Petraeus? I mean, should his mishandling of classified information take him out of the running?
Well, Amy, the problem with General Petraeus, yes, that's a big problem, a very, very big problem. It's akin to what Hillary Clinton did, and maybe a little bit not quite as bad. But the real problem with General Petraeus is, don't forget, Mr. Trump has promised to do away with the strategy of nation building. And General Petraeus, and I got to know him a little bit when I was called in for briefings in the Rumsfeld Pentagon. He's a very, very brilliant guy, very charming, very charismatic, but he is a nation builder. He wrote the Army manual on nation building. And if Mr. Trump wants to get away from nation building, that's exactly the wrong guy to pick.
He's also a gun control advocate, standing with Mark Kelly, Gabby Gifford's husband, to create a new gun control group, which I know that's domestic policy, but it's still problematic in terms of worldview, whether he votes or not. Now, Jed, you were a bit of a Trump skeptic, I think that's fair to say, during the campaign, and I wonder how you view the selections he's made for his cabinet thus far.
So far, I think he's doing very, very well. I mean, much better than any of us thought he would if we thought he got elected. The fact is he won. He's doing a terrific job. I think General Flynn, Mike Flynn, as National Security Advisor, is going to be a terrific pick. I don't know if you've read his book, The Field of Fight, but he's got a really, really good handle on how to win the war against Islamic terrorism. I think General Mattis is the kind of person we've needed for, 50 years to run the Defense Department. He's a real warrior, a warrior intellectual, and he's the kind of guy who is going to set things straight. I don't think that General Mattis is going to do a lot to tolerate the political correctness that has taken over the Pentagon. I think he's going to reverse a lot of that. Ben Carson for HUD, good. Tom Price for HHS is fabulous. I got to know Congressman Price quite well when I was editor of Human Events a few years ago. And he's a very principled, smart conservative. He is the guy who wrote the original alternative to Obamacare. I think that's a really good sign that Obamacare is going bye-bye very soon. So I think all in all, it's a long answer to a short question, but I think Mr. Trump is doing extremely well right now.
All right, let's move on to Europe. Austria rejected their far-right candidate over the weekend, and then the Prime Minister of Italy is stepping down because his referendum failed. Do you think that this is the end of the EU?
We're getting pretty close, Amy. I think that the defeat of the far-right candidate, I think his name was Hofer in Austria, is a good thing. I don't think we want to see that sort of a person getting ahead, especially in Germany. The defeat of Renzi is really a bad thing. He wanted to reform the Italian Constitution to actually make the country governable. Don't forget, they've had, in the 70 or so years since World War II, they've had, 70 or so governments. So they really need to get their handle on governing themselves, and they're not going to do that. Renzi had the right idea. I think that weakens the EU. I think you're going to see the French election is another sign. Hollande is not going to run again for president of France, and I think the guy's name is Francois Fillon, is going to be the moderate right-wing candidate there next year in their election, and he's probably going to win. I think that's all going to be negative things for the EU, and I think they're really going to fall apart sooner rather than later. Brexit, the British vote earlier this year actually, is going to really sign the death warrant for the EU.
Well, the Renzi thing is so interesting because it's such a case study in the dangers of populism. Populism can take a lot of different directions. So this was a continued kind of the anti-establishment fervor in the EU. But what Renzi tried to do was reduce the size of the legislative body in Italy, which has twice as many members as does our U.S. Congress. We're a much smaller country, so too many politicians running around. He probably had a point, but he made the classic mistake of some of these European heads of state of making it a referendum on himself.
Well, I think that's a very penetrating view. I think that's a very, very good way to look at that. As you said, populism can take a lot of different forms. I think populism in Italy means pretty much immediate demographic control of whatever goes on in government. They've got too many members of their parliament. They've got too many people and too many layers in between different layers of government. So basically, Italy at this current time is ungovernable. And I don't think Renzi is unwise. There's too many negatives in that sense. I think Renzi is very smart to be quitting while he can, because Italy is not going to progress unless they get a handle on their own governance. Now,
last year when President Obama sold nearly $2 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan, that was not a problem, even though China didn't appreciate it. President-elect Trump taking a call from the Taiwanese president is bringing us to the brink of thermonuclear war with China. I wonder if you could reconcile those two views of the D.C. press corps for me.
Well, I think that the idea that Trump taking a one phone call is bringing us to the brink of nuclear war is imbecilic. I think that the lefties in the press, of which there are way too many, are just simply looking for ways to pick on Trump. I think taking the call from the newly elected president of Taiwan was the right thing to do. I mean, China, and frankly, no nation, whether it's an ally or an enemy, should be able to tell us that you can't talk to some other nation. That's not something that the president of the United States should put up with in any respect. And Mr. Trump, as president-elect, was right to take the call. I think that Mr. Trump, well, his diplomatic style reminds me of what Winston Churchill said of the late John Foster Dulles, an earlier Secretary of State. I think the quote is that he's the only bull that brings his own china shop with him.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right.
And I think that Mr. Trump is okay doing that. I mean, a lot of that is not a bad thing. I mean, shaking things up. American diplomacy has been just shunning our allies and embracing our enemies for, well, at least the last 8 years. So we've got to change that. We've got to become a superpower again. And, with General Mattis and General Flynn and, Mr. X as Secretary of State, I think really Mr. Trump will get ahead. And that's one last point I'd like to make. Mr. Trump has to pick someone as part of the national security team, which the Secretary of State is. The Secretary of State has to be the kind of person who's going to work well with Mattis and Flynn if Mr. Trump is going to make policy that we really are going to benefit from. So it's wise for him to be very picky, and quite frankly, he might want to ask Mattis and Flynn what they think about the selection of the Secretary of State.
Yeah, and Secretary of State, you didn't mention Mitt Romney. How do you feel about him as a possible Secretary of State?
You know, he's not as bad as some of the others, but I just can't see him taking the job in terms of the competition between him and Mitt Romney, and rather Rudy Giuliani and John Bolton. I think either of the other two would be far, far better. I think Romney is not known for strength. I mean, quite frankly, he's kind of a weak sister. He's been a lot of places and done a lot of things, but I don't think he's the kind of person who you're going to have blend well with Flynn and Mattis and Trump, frankly.
He is former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, now Washington Post columnist, American Spectator contributor. He's Jed Babbin. Jed, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and please, Washington Times, not Washington Post.
Did I say Washington
Those other
Post?
guys. No, God, not the Washington Post.
No, I
God.
didn't. I don't think I said Washington Times, didn't I?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. You may have.
Washington Times. Oh, God, not Washington Post. I got it. Thanks, Jed.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Eddie joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.